I spoke yesterday about Operation Early Dawn, Labour's master plan to free up space in the prisons by, well, letting out prisoners. And there are, of course, inherent issues with this. The main one, of course, which I drew attention to, was the fact that you are letting out people who have a track record of violence, of drug dealing, of domestic abuse, etc., etc., to free up space, which Keir Starmer and the two-tier justice system seem quite intent on filling with people who apparently practice hate speech, which can be as little as sharing a post on Facebook. There are, however, as we discovered, many other issues associated with letting people out of prison early, not just so they can go and reoffend or take some sort of vengeance on the people who put them behind bars in the first place, but also logistical issues such as relocating them back to where they're from, and also the inherent homelessness problem that this is liable to create. Many people, obviously not expecting to be released as early as they have in effect nowhere to go. We saw an interview on the news yesterday in the UK of a man who simply said that now he was released, he would be sleeping on a park bench that evening, and actually wished he hadn't been released early at all. He said he had previously had a comfy bed, 3 square meals, a roommate that he got along well with, and all mod cons, and now he was left homeless, hungry, no job, and nowhere to sleep. But don't worry, in their infinite wisdom, Labour have come up with a scheme to solve the housing issue. And once again, it will of course come at the expense of, hang on, guess who? Yep, it will come at the expense of the taxpayer. Sorry to interrupt the video, just wanted to say a quick thank you to everyone who supports the channel. If you haven't done so already, then I do ask that you kindly click the subscribe button down below. 97% of people who watch these videos aren't currently subscribed, which is crazy, right? It's totally free, you can change your mind, and there won't be any hard feelings if you choose to unsubscribe at a later date. If you do find these videos useful and you want to help me out, you can buy me a beer by clicking the link in the description below, and that also would be very much appreciated, particularly in this hot weather. Anyway, back to the video. Fury as Labour's Justice Secretary reveals freed prisoners are set to be housed in taxpayer-funded hotels as part of early release scheme. Now, it's quite an evocative headline and actually isn't quite as black and white as that. It does turn out that most prisoners, if they have nowhere to go or no housing upon release from prison, most prisoners will be given emergency accommodation for 12 weeks. Which of course is still funded by the taxpayer, but it's not quite the lap of luxury that this headline may initially allude to. However, once space runs out in community accommodation, so emergency housing, then they are talking about housing the released prisoners in budget hotels until they have somewhere else to go. So they've gone from being funded by the taxpayer behind bars to funded by the taxpayer either in emergency housing or ultimately, if that gets full up, and they're planning to release thousands and thousands of prisoners, so it'll probably get full up very quickly, in hotels. There will then obviously be a significant number of empty prison cells, at least in the very short term. But I'm sure with Keir's new hard-on crime, hard-on people who point their fingers at police officers and say hurty words, these will very rapidly get filled up. The irony is that the prisoners, rather than being funded by the taxpayer to stay behind bars in the prisons, are now being funded by the taxpayer to stay in emergency accommodation or in hotels. Meanwhile, the empty cells, which I think are going to get filled up very quickly if Keir and his two-tier justice system continue to prosecute people who use so-called hate speech, i.e. hurty words on social media, at the current rate, they'll get filled up very quickly. The irony being, of course, that a lot of those people are the ones that were protesting against immigrants being put up in hotels at the taxpayer's expense. They are now going to find themselves behind bars at the taxpayer's expense. Meanwhile, the displaced criminals, the displaced convicts who were behind bars, are now being funded at the taxpayer's expense to stay in hotels because they've been released early with nowhere to go. I don't know where Labour seems to think this infinite amount of taxpayer money comes from. Surely, at this rate, the only people that will actually end up paying to have a roof over their head and 3 square meals a day will be the people who currently pay into the system via a punitive taxation system, or people who have spent their entire lives paying into the system and have now retired only to find they've had their heating allowance taken away. And instead, the money be used to house either the people who've come here illegally, the people who've complained about the people who came here illegally and been arrested for doing so, or the people who have been removed from prison to make way for the people who complained about the people who came here illegally, who now have to be housed at the taxpayer's expense because they've got nowhere to go because of this poorly thought out scheme. Like I say, the biggest issue, of course, with Early Dawn is the fact they are releasing people who have a track record of violence, particularly domestic violence, but also drug dealing, gang activity, and a list of other far more serious crimes, dare I say, than some of the others we've seen convictions for most recently. They've spoken to prisoners. Many of them don't want to be released. Many of them don't have anywhere to go. They've spoken to former victims of crime who are scared of the release of these prisoners. But yet they persevere with this scheme, freeing up prison spaces supposedly for dangerous criminals, meanwhile releasing dangerous criminals out onto the streets. None of it makes any sense, but as Keir Starmer's term in government continues, very, very little seems to be making sense. Stay safe and stay sane, everybody.